Ok, ricominciamo. Good morning again. It's really a pleasure to have the possibility to host the presentation of the Energy Efficiency 2022, which has been held this year, organized, coordinated by Dr. Nicholas Howard, Nick, let's say in short. It's an economist, graduated in Oxford. It's a tremendous runner, by the way. Should be the guy that should be the guy that we should take as a member of firm staff for. We have a marathon next week. He's a serious runner. He cannot be beaten. And this is one of the reasons why we met in Saudi Arabia, and we worked together we probably met 10 years ago, and we worked together. He was, lucky him, permanent. I was just a visitor, going there from time to time, but definitely this passion that we share for running was something that apart of the work, the job we did on energy efficiency, by the way, and many other different issues, but we had good times and we share a part of our life for years. So I'm very proud and very happy he found, let's say, a place which is Paris International Energy Agency, where he could definitely show his huge capabilities in order to organize writing material. So the book, by the way, the book, the energy efficiency, you can download for free from the website of the International Energy Agency, which is another reason that link us, because I worked in the agency a long time ago. Of course, wartime is a difficult time, is a tough time to organize material like this. As you know, we, like Italy and many other European countries, we were supposed to reduce coal in power, and then the war pushed us in different direction. So writing on energy efficiency during this difficult period also add some complexity to the overall story. But considering his experience and the attention which all the possible policies have been examined and scrutinized in the book, you will find all is too much. Say many answers that you need in terms of energy efficiency. That's in short what I'm saying after considering the book, that as expected for me, that Nick did as usual a tremendous job to complete the whole work. Also during this difficult time for us, for analysts and for energy analysts in particular, is a very difficult time. I don't want to go further, so the floor is yours. The rule of the game is that Nick will take 45. And then we can collect questions from the floor, and the people which is not physically here can send their question, let's say 10 minutes before the end of presentation. So I need time to print it and to choose to show and to discuss with Nick your question. So if you are not here, you're so unlucky not to be here to share this day with us. Send your using the chat of the system, and we will collect your question. And if there is time, if the question are, as I expect, clever enough, we will propose your question to Nick, and he will give an answer. Thank you very much, Nick. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Lanza and FEAM, for the invitation to present today on the latest energy efficiency market report from the IEA. It's a real pleasure to be here among so many esteemed colleagues, and I'd also like to acknowledge Professor Gagliotti, who I also have had the pleasure and privilege to work alongside on many occasions, and his work on energy modeling and applied policy also serves as an example to us all. The efficiency market report, which I'm about to present to you today, is of course a big project and work from across the agency. I'm coordinating and lead author, but there's a big team that contributes to all the different aspects, be it energy demand, energy investment, energy technology tracking, energy prices, the data team. So I wouldn't want to, I was very grateful for Alessandro's kind introduction, but also don't want to overstate my particular contribution to the report. The Italian government is, of course, also a key partner for the work the IEA does on energy efficiency. And I'd especially like to acknowledge their leadership in supporting and shaping the digital demand-driven electricity networks initiative, or 3DEN project, which we'll hear a little bit more about during the presentation today. This report is available to download on the IEA website, and for the first time associated with the release, we provided an energy efficiency data tool, which is quite extensive and free to use for those who wish to explore some of the data that we've used behind the report in more detail, extra countries, sectors. You can choose how you wish to structure queries. The market report was released in December last year and takes a look back at the past 12 months of the energy efficiency landscape. This latest report had two special focus chapters, one on energy efficiency's role in helping manage through the energy crisis, and a deep dive into the ASEAN region, which has been experiencing some of the fastest growth in energy demand in the world. But before I jump into the report and talk to you about the most recent trends and a lot of facts and figures, which you would expect from the IEA, I'd like to briefly jump back in time into the past and begin with a story of the first big energy crisis of the 1970s. There are two reasons for this. The first, and I'm sure the relevance of this is not lost on you here today, is that this period in the 70s saw a turning point in how most people and governments saw energy, from being relatively cheap and unlimited to being costly and requiring careful stewardship. And the question of energy crises and turning points is something I'd like to explore and perhaps discuss with you today. The second reason has to do with the man in this photo, a man who I'm sure needs little by way of introduction to a group of colleagues like we have here today. As many of you are probably already aware, former President Jimmy Carter last month entered hospice care and is unfortunately nearing the end of his life. This picture perhaps is the defining image of the 1970s energy crisis, or at least for many of us energy people. And it's special for two reasons. The first is, and hopefully something this is not lost on those here in Milan with an eye for style, is his fashion choice. The president is appearing by the fireside wearing a sweater, or perhaps what we in England would call a cardigan or woolen vest. I'm not sure what the Italian equivalent would be for this. Cardigan, oh, well, that's a good sign for it at least has a word. But it was quite controversial at the time. And the reason why he is wearing this cardigan was that he was encouraging people to not just lessen the dependence on foreign oil by finding ways to increase energy efficiency, but also to reduce energy use through conservation, such as turning down thermostats and wearing a jumper. Ideas that were quite controversial at the time and in many quarters continue to be so. Another major theme of the time was the switch from oil to other fuels, including clean energy sources, which came of age perhaps during the 1970s. While there are differences, much like the crisis we face today, especially here in Europe, the energy crisis of the 1970s was triggered by a conflict that saw the temporary suspension of energy supplies from the Middle East to many countries, with oil prices which jumped fourfold, triggering a global economic recession. It was also a time when many countries introduced fuel efficiency standards for the first times, and the government actively encouraged fuel switching for energy security reasons. These policies had a big impact, with energy per kilometre falling by 40% for cars, almost by half in just 10 years after the measures were introduced. Energy standards requiring insulation were introduced to building codes, and for the first time, energy performance standards were set for the most common appliances, creating a wave of momentum which has continued to this day. For many people, it might be surprising to hear that the average energy consumption of common devices such as our lights, refrigerators, heating and cooling appliances, and our televisions has fallen by over 70% in many cases since these times. This is truly incredible engineering. Today's cars, buildings, appliances are vastly more efficient thanks to the wave of policies that began in the 1970s. The other notable shift was in the power sector, with the use of oil for generating electricity going from being commonplace to something which today is very niche, used mainly on islands and emergencies in most countries. Indeed, it was during these times, in fact, 50 years ago next year, that the IEA was created to monitor energy markets and support cooperation and coordination among governments on these issues. Now, fast forward to today, and not since the 1970s, have governments and citizens around the world been under so much pressure as a result of high energy prices and supply constraints. And this is being felt particularly keenly here in Europe. It should be no surprise, therefore, that given the last year, our most recent efficiency market report is framed by the current energy crisis. Energy price and supply chain pressures that were already brewing in the year before, in 2021, have been amplified by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and subsequent sanctions and disruption to energy and broader economic markets. Energy efficiency is now at the center of policy agendas as governments and citizens around the world urgently look to save energy, secure supply, and reduce energy bills. There is also another key difference between today and the 1970s, and that is the role of next generation digital technologies that can better manage energy consumption by both helping reduce our energy demand and scheduling it to a time of day when the grid is at its greenest, cheapest, and most stable. So from the current crisis arises the first message of our report, that we are seeing strong signs of governments turning to efficiency, including electrification and digitalization, as it is the best way to simultaneously meet the energy affordability, security, and climate goals. Given this economic backdrop, it should also be no surprise that global energy intensity improvements are expected to perform strongly in 2022 at 2%, almost 4 times the rate achieved during the 2 previous years. As you know, energy intensity is the leading measure of energy efficiency at the economy-wide level and represents the total amount of energy needed to produce a unit of GDP. However, last year's result comes after 5 years of improvements averaging only around 1% per year, far off track from the 4% annual improvement needed on average over this decade between 2020 and 2030 to achieve global climate goals and align with the IEA's net zero scenario. This brings us to the central question which we explore in this year's market report. Is 2022 likely to see the beginning of a sustained turning point for energy efficiency, similar to what we experienced following the energy crisis of the 1970s? We can look at these trends a little bit more at the country level. A few major countries have the ability to shift the needle on global energy intensity, and the G20 represented here is around 80% of global energy consumption. The first point to note is that there is a wide range of energy intensity between countries. This reflects things such as economic structure, energy prices, climate, and other social and political factors. For example, in Russia, it takes almost 4 times as much energy to produce the same GDP as it does in the United Kingdom. During the COVID pandemic in 2020 and 2021, energy consumption and GDP fluctuated widely around the world, reflecting the impact of the pandemic and the economic disruption and rebound. For these reasons, it's good to look at longer-term trends to see what's going on. In the last 5 years of last decade, the countries with the fastest rates of energy intensity improvement were the UK with 2.8%, France with 2.6%, Germany and the US and China 2.5%, and India with 2.4%. In Italy, which has one of the highest performing economies in terms of energy intensity in the G20 already, the annual rate of improvement dropped back from around 2% per year to 1% over the course of the first part of the decade compared to the second part of the decade. This slowdown reflected a global trend, with the rest of the world also experiencing a fall in the rate of energy intensity improvement from 2.2 to 1.4% over the course of the decade. However, 4 countries, while 13 countries energy intensity improvement slowed down, 4 countries still managed to improve their rate of progress. France moved up from 1.8 to 2.6, Korea from 1.3 to 1.8. Brazil staged a turnaround from being in a situation of worsening energy intensity, that is becoming more energy intensive, to a situation where energy intensity was stabilized. The USA also slightly improved its performance. We can also look at these changes in energy intensity at the sector level, where we look at the energy consumed per unit of floor area in buildings, the energy used per unit of value added in industry, and the energy needed to travel 1 kilometer of distance by cars, for example. So this is perhaps a much more physical measure of energy intensity. There are many different aspects to these measures, and there are several others which we go into in further detail in our report. But the overall picture is that energy efficiency progress has slowed down at the global level, especially when it comes to buildings and industry, while improvements in transport are holding steady. Overall, given the slower progress on energy efficiency, the world is not on track to achieve the energy consumption pathway set out in the IEA net zero scenario, meaning higher energy supply will be needed, more will be needed than might have otherwise been the case. While this global picture may seem a little gloomy, we should also be clear that in individual countries and in specific sectors, there's been some truly exceptional performance on efficiency improvements that have helped lower energy consumption in absolute terms across entire sectors of the economy, even as the levels of activity and quality of energy services increased in those sectors. For example, in the UK, over the last 20 years, overall energy consumption in residential buildings fell by 15%, even as 500 million meters squared of floor space was added. That's about 250,000 extra homes per year. In Japan, the total energy consumption of cars and light trucks fell by more than 24% over 20 years, even as the distance traveled by Japanese motorists rose by 26 billion kilometers a year over that time, around 400 extra kilometers for every car on the road in 2022. There are many more examples of such success stories in the report, and I'd invite you to explore these through the Energy Efficiency Indicators database, which I mentioned earlier as a tool associated with the release. The message is that energy efficiency has delivered and is delivering strong results for many countries, even if overall global progress had slowed over the course of the last decade. Furthermore, when looking at the longer-term picture, the progress on energy efficiency is a lot more encouraging. Efficiency has been one of the largest measures to reduce CO2 emissions. And here we present Kaya identity. Since 2000, there's been upwards pressure on CO2 emissions arising from increasing populations and income, which has been moderated by improvements in energy intensity. In the most recent decade, the effect of efficiency and intensity progress has almost doubled compared to the decade before. When combined with shifts in the carbon intensity of the energy mix, the effect on lowering CO2 emissions has been even greater. The net effect of these changes means that efficiency gains of the last 20 years have halved the potential emissions growth from rising incomes and population. Without these efficiency improvements, CO2 emissions and energy consumption would be around 30% higher today. So let's take now a deep dive into some energy consumption trends, more recent. One of the main drivers of energy intensity progress that we are tracking very closely is changes in energy demand. Over the last few years, we saw a global contraction of around 4% in 2020 due to the initial impact of COVID restrictions. This is global final energy demand, followed by a rebound of just over 5% in 2021. This compared with longer term growth over the last decade of around 1.3 to 1.7%. In the building sector, energy consumption rose by 5 times more in 2021 than it fell in 2020 due to COVID. While space and water heating are the largest energy consumers in the building sector, space cooling is growing the fastest, up 6.5% in 2021, as many more people gain access to air conditioners for the first time, particularly in the ASEAN region, which we focused on this year in the report. Transport energy demand also recovered after the initial impact of COVID in 2020, up 8% in 2021, but still had not reached pre-COVID levels, as sectors such as aviation remain slower to rebound. Industrial energy demand towards more industrial energy demand was the least negatively impacted through COVID crisis, holding steady in 2020 and experiencing one of its strongest years of growth in recent times in 2021. This brought about a shift in the makeup of energy demand to more energy-intensive industry over the last few years and was one of the main explanations for slower efficiency progress at the global level during the COVID pandemic. It's important for us to note, however, that even with slower rates of improvement, avoided energy demand from energy efficiency improvements have strengthened energy security. For example, over the last 6 years at the global level, we estimate that improvements in energy intensity have helped avoid around half the energy consumption that would have resulted from economic growth and this shift towards more energy intensive economic structure at the global level. So current estimates for energy demand in 2022 suggest that there's been a significant moderation in overall growth, reflecting how consumers and markets have been impacted by high energy prices and supply pressures. Overall energy demand growth is expected to have dropped back from 5% in 2021 to be closer to around 1% last year at the global level. Over the course of last year, estimates of economic growth also became more and more gloomy and uncertain, being revised downwards from being close to 4% at the start of 2022 to just above 3% as the year progressed. And of course, GDP growth is one of the key inputs into calculating energy intensity and also a leading indicator of where energy demand might be going. While it's still early days this year, estimates suggest even weaker economic growth is expected at the global level, with estimates of around 2.6 to 2.9%. As you can see from the chart here, global oil and coal demand are also expected to soften this year, while electricity growth is expected to remain steady and natural gas is stabilizing with no change after falling last year at the global level. This story with natural gas is very important and can be seen in a little bit more detail here with data taken from the IEA's most recent gas market report. What we see for 2022 is global natural gas demand expected to be down 1.6%, which compares with longer term growth experienced over recent years of 2% per annum. This has been led lower by lower consumption in Europe, which recently exceeded its own targets to reduce overall gas demand by 15%, achieving a 19% reduction. And one of the questions we'll be interested to hear from you on is if there are any views on whether or not this represents a structural shift in gas demand in Europe. Just to take a quick look at where this gas is consumed in terms of end users, so not in terms of the power sector. This means that we see that almost the majority of end users is split between manufacturing and industry and heating, with water and cooking representing a relatively small share of total overall gas consumption. Notably, the top 7 countries are responsible for the lion's share of European gas demand. I'd like to return now to some of the driving forces behind recent changes in energy consumption. Energy-related cost of living pressures had been a major concern last year, driven by high fossil fuel prices. Increased energy costs were the single biggest contributor to inflation experienced this year in last year in most countries, pushing up the cost of living for families worldwide and setting back progress on energy access in emerging and developing countries. Energy poverty is not only a financial issue facing people, but a health one, with individuals and families facing the prospect of having to cut back on energy consumption and comfort levels to meet household budgets. In addition to the underlying efficiency of transport systems and buildings, energy bills are also a function of the amount of energy consumed in each household, distances traveled by car, the fuel mix, price of various fuels, as well as any taxation and energy bill support measures. These differences mean that exposure to higher prices varies significantly around the world, with some countries more exposed to higher electricity prices for residential use, or gas prices for heating, or oil prices for transport. For example, due to the Hungarian government's utility cost reduction program, Budapest is one of the cheapest places to buy natural gas in the European Union, while in other countries, the cost of heating and other residential use has almost doubled. The degree to which higher market prices for transport fuels, gas, and electricity are passed through to consumers is a significant determinant of end-use user prices, which we show here, with the difference often being absorbed through increased public subsidies. To address this emerging cost of living crisis, governments have allocated more than 550 billion in temporary support to help with affordability this year. In emerging market and developing economies, the value of this temporary support now exceeds that provided for clean energy investments since 2020. During 2022, the OECD and IMF recommended winding down general subsidies and price controls and shifting the balance of this funding towards providing more targeted support, especially to vulnerable households. More focused policies on housing quality was seen as equally important, given that people living in the least efficient homes can face energy bills of more than an order of magnitude higher than those in the most efficient. Targeted policy support that improves efficiency, reduces bills while providing in-kind income support that permanently locks in energy bill savings. Of course, the energy crisis is particularly acute in countries with a greater exposure to natural gas in their energy mix. Heating is one of the most important areas where greater efficiency can help in this regard. Natural gas is the dominant fuel used for heating worldwide, representing around 40% of residential heating demand globally. However, the exposure to gas in the heating fuel mix varies widely among countries, with some almost independent from gas and others for the majority using it for the majority or almost all of their heating needs. Across the world, governments are moving fast to bring in measures to reduce this exposure. And in Europe, where countries representing around 80% of residential gas demand have plans to ban or phase out new gas connections in coming years. Efficiency measures are the first best policy to reduce the impact of these rising energy bills. Here we see the annual residential energy bill for a typical building categorized by efficiency level. Those who live in an average home in the more efficient B and C classes are more protected from rising prices, with energy bills around 40% lower than for people who live in a less efficient home. For families in the least efficient homes, they can be paying up to 3 times more for the same level of comfort. Unfortunately, the evidence we have gathered suggests is those who are least able to afford energy who are most exposed to poor quality and low efficiency housing. This underscores the importance of government retrofit programs that target those facing energy poverty and live in poor quality housing conditions. This example here is for a typical home in the United Kingdom, but the same story is true for most other countries. A similar situation exists with transport energy costs, which typically represent around half of the energy bill of most families and households around the world. New, more efficient cars can be around 40% cheaper to run than less efficient models in the same class, and electric vehicles can be typically around half the cost compared to their most efficient conventional equivalents to operate. In addition to helping with affordability, efficiency plays a vital role in energy security. What we see in this chart are the forces pushing global energy demand higher through greater economic activity, such as incomes, population, business activity, as well as structural shifts towards or away from more energy-intensive activities. These, as we saw before, can be offset by the energy moderating forces of improved efficiency. On balance, efficiency gains have halved potential growth in energy demand over the last 6 years. Taking, as I said, the key point here is that this saving in through efficiency has delivered at 2022 prices energy savings of $680 billion across IEA countries. So we can put that alongside the amount spent on temporary bill support to see the payoff from efficiency versus temporary bill support. An important positive trend we also observed in 2022 has been continued strong growth in energy efficiency related investment. This is expected to be up 16%, rising to 560 billion. This year's result builds on last year's extremely strong growth of 25%, boosted by COVID recovery packages and rebounding economic activity, especially in the building sector. This year, we saw a switch in the prime driver of efficiency-related investment to transport, which was up 47%, driven by the rapid uptake of electric vehicles, which made up 1 in every 8 vehicles sold last year. Recent policy announcements, such as the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, Repower EU in Europe, and the Green Transformation GX plan in Japan, are set to increase the overall level of energy efficiency investment even further, with levels expected to reach around 1 trillion in the second half of this decade, as tracked by the IEA's announced policy scenario. However, these levels still need to be boosted by around a third to be consistent with the IEA net zero scenario. Another area where we have seen strong growth has been in electric heat pumps, particularly in Europe, where the number of units sold have increased by around 30% each year for the last 2 years. This has been driven by strong policy support in the form of incentive programs in many countries, which has helped address the issue of relatively higher upfront costs for heat pumps. Heat pumps are a key technology to reduce reliance on Russian gas in Europe and was the subject of an IEA special report on the topic, released about the same time as the Energy Efficiency Market Report last year in December. A key finding of this work is that achieving heat pump sales of 4 million units per year by 2025 could reduce EU annual gas consumption by 7 billion cubic meters a year, roughly equivalent to the amount of gas provided to Europe by the Trans-Adriatic pipeline the year before. The share of electricity in the total energy consumption has been steadily increasing over the last 10 years, from 15% in 2000 to 20% in 2022. As we've seen with electric vehicles and heat pumps, the transition to meet net zero goals, a rapid increase in electricity demand fueled by renewable energy is needed to power fuel switching. However, if unmanaged, this additional electricity demand will place huge strains on the power system. This is especially true in systems with increasing levels of variable renewable energy sources. Increasing the flexibility of electricity demand will provide benefits to the electricity grid. Energy efficiency and demand-side measures are increasingly about reducing peak power use and shifting power consumption towards the time of maximum renewable penetration or production. Digitalization plays an important role here in enabling this through more granular data, new ways of analyzing data for better insights and controls, and greater visibility on the performance and capacity of various assets. For instance, digitalization allows more controllability and adjustability of operations, enabling consumers to react to signals sent by the power system. As artificial intelligence and automation diminishes the cost of reacting to a price signal, it makes it much easier for smaller sources to participate in markets for flexibility. This can in turn provide power system services such as reducing grid congestion and enhancing resilience. As a concrete example, here we have the classic energy load profile of a building, and then adding in the impact of improved energy efficiency and the shift in load when significant renewable energy is added. What digital controls focus on system level efficiency can help achieve is flattening of this load curve, which reduces costs and brings about greater grid stability. This shift from traditional power systems characterized by centralized generation with one-way energy flows from producer to consumer and generally large investments on the supply side towards one of high system stability is transitioning towards a new system which has a larger number of smaller distributed renewable generation capacity, such as wind and solar, with more and more two-way flows of energy between producers and consumers. This shift introduces a number of important policy questions for governments. What are the functionalities we need? What needs to change? Who needs incentives, when and how? What are the possible new governance arrangements and mechanisms? What are useful guiding principles to consider? What skills are needed? And how does this, what are the implications for future workforce? These questions among the issues being explored by the Digital Demand-Driven Electricity Networks Initiative project, 3DEN, where we are extremely pleased to say that the government of Italy has had the foresight and leadership to facilitate the IEA's work. This has included funding from the Ministry for Environment and Energy Security and working closely with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as a consultative group including Terna, Enel, and research institutes RSC, the Polytechnic Institute of Milan, and other important Italian stakeholders. The project has a global scope, including 37 members from 14 countries and several concrete pilot projects taken in partnership with UNEP. This year will also see the launch of two important reports, the first on smart grids in emerging markets and developing countries, which we look to launch at the Global Conference on Energy Efficiency in June in Paris, and the second report on grids of the future, which focuses on the transformational role that digitalization can play in supporting net zero goals, planned to be launched at COP28 in December. And I'm sure there might be some recognition of the photo in this on the cover of one of our reports from last year. I'd be interested in your views of these buildings. Now I'm very quickly going to go through some of the material in our report on ASEAN countries, where energy consumption has doubled essentially over the last 20 years. And the region has set targets to achieve a 23 renewable energy share in primary energy supply, and a 35% share of renewable energy in installed power capacity by 2025. Overall, total final consumption in the ASEAN region had slowed, had risen by 20% over the last decade, which is much higher than world average, which you can see in this chart. This is particularly being driven by industry and transport. Interestingly, total final consumption in the building sector is down, primarily due to the phasing out of traditional biomass as the region moves towards greater energy access, and phasing out of traditional cook stoves, for example. However, this has led to this very, very strong growth in power demand, which can put pressures on sustainability, given the high current reliance on coal and gas in the region. Here we see the rapid transition to clean cooking that's been experienced in the region. However, more than 200 million people in the region, especially in rural areas, still lack access and rely on traditional biomass. Space cooling has been one of the particularly fastest growing areas of electricity demand growth in the world, and much of that is being driven through demand growth in this region. And what is interesting, which we explore in this year's market report, that the most efficient cooling systems need not also be the most expensive. And so the traditional idea that a better air conditioner unit has higher upfront costs is not necessarily always the case, which points to the need of stronger efficiency standards to phase out some of the least efficient units on the market. And if we look at where the status of selected energy efficiency policies in the region, we see that there has been very good progress made on residential air conditioners, and some good progress on residential refrigerators, but there still remain large gaps in some of the fundamental energy efficiency tools that can be used to help shape and guide energy consumption in industrial motors and in the transport sector. For instance, while globally fuel economy standards are commonplace in the transport sector, no country in the ASEAN region has yet introduced minimum energy performance standards. This is part of a program of work which the IEA is conducting in the region, with several roadmaps in the building sector and interactive online training courses that can be used to help build capacity and access to best practices in this area. So just to step back now to the key theme that I started with, which is will we be seeing a turning point for energy efficiency progress as a result of the current energy crisis? Now, there are many glimmers of hope or elements for optimism here. Countries have mobilized truly phenomenal spending for efficiency measures in various crisis response packages. National plans with a major focus on efficiency have been launched by 16 governments, representing over half of global energy use. And I think we can say quite clearly that there's been a global wave of energy awareness campaigns helping citizens to take action and reduce demand. Digital demand response has become much more mainstream, with several major power emergencies last year being using digital technologies to manage demand. We see heat pump incentives ramping up and operating in countries covering almost half of global energy use of buildings. And 1 in 8 cars sold is electric, thanks to strong consumer demand and government support. We see cooling efficiency policies implemented or under development in all ASEAN countries, one of the fastest 8 regions of fastest growing growth, and 31 emerging and developing economy governments are developing new building codes, which brings the global total to 111 once enacted. And then finally, the investments made through efficiency in IEA countries last year saved around 680 billion in energy costs. So taken together, there are many hopeful signs that this could be a turning point similar to the 1970s. However, many challenges remain to sustaining this progress. And just in way of conclusion, this year we'll be holding the 7th annual Global Conference on Energy Efficiency in Paris between the 6th and 8th of June, which is looking to be one of the largest meetings of government ministers and experts specifically focused on the topic of energy efficiency and many of the themes and issues which we touched on today. And so we do see this global wave of interest and recognition of the importance of efficiency, and it will be important to see the next steps and how this agenda is taking forward, and whether or not, like in the 70s, such progress can be sustained to really build momentum that drives change in the coming years. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. From the air, I have a question, which is not exactly a question, say. You mentioned the data analysis tool for the energy sector. Has it been published, and how can be assessed? I guess it's the website of the IEA, right?
Yeah, exactly. So to make it easy and clear, if you search for Energy Efficiency 2022 Market Report, you'll see a box where you can explore the actual report, and then there's a data tool. And you can go into the data tool, and it's an interactive exploration of the energy efficiency indicators database, which is quite rich. So yeah, that's one of the best ways into it, and some new data is accessible there that wasn't available before.
During the days of the jumper, was that the days in which Carter decided to install 32 solar panels in the roof of the White House? You didn't mention it. I think it's another point, crucial point of the change vis-a-vis the existing politics so far. Anyway, I have a question, but the floor is yours first. If there is any question, we'll be delighted. Francesco Vona, Professor Vona.
Yeah, thanks for the very nice So I have a question about the measure of energy efficiency, because and also the decomposition you did between structural factor, sectoral shift and energy efficiency within sector. I think on this my suggestion, I don't know if you have the data, but you can improve a bit, because now we know from all the literature on trade and environment that a lot of the improvement within a sector are related to compositional shift. So basically, you are going to import energy-intensive goods from abroad, and so you are going to reduce artificially the energy efficiency of the country. And I think, exploring this issue, you can do it with word input-output table and stuff like that. Would be good, to distinguish these two margin of adjustment and to understand this. Also, in a world where, we expect a slowdown of trade, so actually, there is also, in scenario. And the second point, I think, this is a bit more political, honestly. But I've been working a lot with the OECD on these topics, on distributional effect of environmental policies. And we know that all these energy efficiency policies, for building vehicles and stuff like that, they are extremely regressive. And there is this very nice study for the US of Borenstein and Davis that shows really how more regressive they are compared to a carbon tax, also. And on all of these, I think, you mentioned means tested policies, but reconciling energy poverty and subsidizing, I think we should push more this. It's very essential also to gain political acceptability for this type of transition. This is more.
Thanks very much for those excellent comments. Yes, on world input-output tables and trade effects, I think that's as you say, a very good area of improvement that we can look to in future market reports. And as to your second point, and I agree that when we just look at the sheer volume of funding that is being mobilized at short notice for these temporary subsidies versus the amount of funding that perhaps goes into structural efficiency, the former absolutely dwarfs the latter. And as energy prices come down, there may be a window to boost the through this transitional phase to give this targeted support, whether it's through efficiency programs, specific vouchers for energy services, and because clearly this is a temporary situation, and should the subsidies stay in place untargeted for a long time, you can see that this is definitely weakening incentives to conserve energy and improve efficiency over time. And so we might ask ourselves, what would be, clearly in a crisis, governments will and should act to help citizens, but in the longer term, what is the best way to do that, and allowing energy to be priced at its full cost, including cost to the environment, is an important part of getting the incentives right. So I agree. That's a good point. So I think the point that you're making is that the richer, the more well-off households are also consuming a lot more energy, perhaps, than less well-off households. They're more able to afford upgrades, and so receiving these support, whether it's for heat pumps, electric vehicles, retrofits, can be tailored. I think one has to, in the Californian system, obviously there are very large energy savings from the large energy consumers that tend to be more wealthy households, but there is a separate streamline program for dealing with these equity issues to make sure that they're not lost, and funding is balances this effectiveness in terms of reducing energy consumption at large with achieving these equity goals. So there are some good practices that we can learn from around the world that can be replicated, I think.
Thank you. In general, if you don't use the mic, you are not listening outside this room. Please, Professor Galeotti.
Two points. The first one is a general comment. Notwithstanding the optimistic message, when we teach the Kaya identity to our students, invariably we have to show that improvements in energy efficiency and reduction in carbon intensity are not enough to compensate for the population growth and the growth of the income, so that emissions increase. But aside from this comment, first, the stress is invariably on energy efficiency improvements brought about by technological devices, technological improvement, adoptions of these new technologies. Is there any possibility, or have you thought about, saying something about the other driver of energy efficiency, which is a change in habits and preferences? Whether it can be somewhat quantified, or whether it's worth saying something about that, because in rich countries, that is, I'm sure that is a component that has to that has a role. The second one is on a topic that we are explicitly dealing with here at FEEM and also at IEA in general. But I was wondering whether your team has been given a thought to critical raw materials, or the issue, because it's going to be the main issue coming around in the next years, and impacting also, as I said, the ways energy efficiency takes place.
Thanks for those comments. I think the answers are yes and yes and yes. Very briefly, on behavior, definitely, I think that there is this wave of awareness, I think, that has occurred in the last year. How that manifests into specific changes, such as turning down thermostats in houses. We see some initial evidence, which is very promising on that. There's digital tools, and smart meters is actually giving us a data set that we're looking into to see how consumers are responding to various signals, and what's possible in behavior. So I think you're right, that is a key strategic issue we currently should be looking at. And also regarding the critical minerals question, of course, I think the whole question of what this big shift towards electrification means for everything from the copper in the wires, not just the the rare earth materials that are needed in many of the more complex applications of clean tech. This has huge implications for energy efficiency and also the distribution network. And the point that I would make, as the IEA has of course published a report on clean tech and critical minerals last year, which is an excellent resource, lots of data on that. But the point from the efficiency team that I would make is that the greater the level of energy efficiency in your appliances, in your vehicles, in your the lower the requirement on the system in terms of the transformers, the copper into the network that needs to go on, not just on the generation side as well. And this could provide a major help in addressing those critical mineral shortages. The other issue that we're looking at is the rise of large cars. You know, everybody seems to be trending towards buying larger cars, sport utility vehicles, four-wheel drives, and when these electrify, it's a very large battery and system compared to something which is quite a lot smaller, which requires a lot less energy. So this also, you know, has an efficiency dimension, a material efficiency dimension, and resource efficiency regarding the recycling of all of these materials as well, that we should be looking at too, I think, as this clean transition plays out. So thanks for the questions, spot on.
So I have a question concerning the dynamic aspect of efficiency, because efficiency is a very dynamic concept, and the most efficient technology of today will not be, of course, the most efficient technology in 5 years from now. So adopting efficient technologies now might hinder the adoption of more efficient technologies in 5 years from now, because they have a payback period and more in general a useful life. My question to you is, where are you looking at, let's say, an optimal rate of replacement, also considering the fact that whenever I buy something new, there is a lot of energy and materials consumed to produce that new efficient appliance, efficient technology. So what is the IEA vision in terms of the dynamic aspects of efficiency and replacement of technologies, given the impact they have on production and therefore on energy material consumption? Thank you.
Well, the first point I would make is often when we're replacing appliances or cars, they're already quite old. And so maybe you're looking at 10 years, possibly. That's quite common. And there is a massive jump between even an average appliance today or car, which is new, and what was 10 years ago. And we show those numbers in the report. So you're upgrading massively by just buying not even the best available technology on the market, but the average technology on the market today. And so given that we're already so far behind off track meeting so that our net zero pathway and goals, anything we can do to reduce demand as quickly as possible in the next decade is particularly important. Also because while the electricity network is predominantly still fossil fuel, you get a much bigger return for reducing energy consumption, because it's eating into your coal and gas demand, whereas maybe in 10 years time there'll be a much greater penetration of renewable energy, and so you're still getting a benefit, but it's more of this system benefit that I was speaking about before, which is the dynamic load management, reducing stresses on the grid, ensuring stability. So this is what the world looks like in 5 to 10 years when renewable energy has penetrated a lot. So the payoff and the nature of efficiency changes, but the payoff is so high, I think now, and we're so far behind, delaying efficiency would be, I think we need to, the IEA view is it needs to be maximized as fast as possible this decade. So it's front loaded into our scenarios, essentially.
I have a second question, which is pretty tricky. I'm trying to describe it. Say, if you are interested in, if the International Energy Agency is working on the energy consumption related to crypto mining activities. In short, the question is much more complicated, but you know, this is the summary and conclusion. Are you working on crypto mining activities, or the energy component of the crypto mining activities?
there has been some work in this area as part of our work in energy consumption of also data centers. And I think every year Bitcoin and the energy consumption of Bitcoin comes up as a perennial topic, and it still is a serious issue, I would say, and one that's we have sort of active analysis under the sort of broader umbrella of the energy consumption of data centers. But you know, the point that we would make is that the efficiency of data centers has been very high, like the rate of improvement has been very high. So the volume of data that's being processed is rising exponentially, but we're not seeing, you know, energy consumption tracking, you know, up as much with the volume of data. And part of that's because of this. It's just such strong efficiencies are being achieved in that sector. But there's some specific research on this. So if you're interested, I can link you with the right person at the agency.
He or she is the one. Okay. That's it. That's all. Thank you very much, Nick, for your presentation. And thank you all. And the next event is 28. Don't forget. Thank you.